All right, in this one I want to look at Raspberry Pi 4 and how to set up a Pi hole. Now, you don't need to use a Raspberry Pi 4 for this one, but that's what I had that I wasn't using for anything else. And we'll talk about some of the specifics about setting up the Pi hole, getting it working on the network, and what I'll actually do in this video is go through it completely live so you can see every step of the way, everything that's required. One of the things that I've noticed, a lot of videos don't actually tell you every little bit that's required in setting up Pi holes and what to do if the keyboard layout isn't just right. So there's a lot of little things like that that we'll look at that happen in the true setup, because we're not just typing up a guide that say copy and paste this into your SSH. We're going to go through it. I'm going to set up the SD card and do everything for you on this computer. So what do you need for this project? You need a Raspberry Pi, obviously, and this one is a Raspberry Pi 4. I did a kind of initial impressions on it. I've used it for a home server for a website. Whoops. I've used it for a home server on a website, for my personal website. I've used it for a server for my 3D printer, so you can access that on the network. And I've used it for a home VPN so that I can access my home network from outside. Those are just a few of the types of things you could do with a Pi hole, but I think one of the most kind of set it and forget it type things that you can do is set up this home DNS ad blocker. And it's really effective, and there are a couple little things that make it inconvenient sometimes, but once you learn how to work around those, it's pretty useful. So you'll need some kind of Raspberry Pi. This is the case that comes with the CanaKit, and it has a small fan in it. The fan's pretty loud, so if you're going to use this with the fan that's included, I would probably hide it somewhere behind a closed door or in a cabinet. It'll keep it cool, but actually running Pi hole on something like this, a Raspberry Pi 4, 3, or even a 2, they don't generate much heat. So if you stick one of these little cheap aluminum heat sinks on it, you could get them for literally a couple pennies, and it'll just stick right on there. That'll be completely fine. You don't need active cooling on something like this. That's the whole point of having these small computers like this. You also need an SD card, and most Raspberry Pis will use a micro SD. This one is just a Samsung Evo 32 gig. Definitely overkill for this. You only need about 4 gigabytes to install the raspbian and the Pi hole stuff. So you don't need anything like this. It doesn't even have to be super fast. The one thing you do have to make sure you have is an Ethernet cable, and you're not using the Wi-Fi, because if you're using the Wi-Fi as the DNS server, that's going to add that latency for every request that goes out. So going to a website is going to feel slow and sluggish because you're going to have an extra 20 to 30 milliseconds each way of latency just to get contact with the Pi hole, and then the normal latency to go out to the internet. So you definitely want your Pi hole set up and directly plugged into the router. We'll talk about that when I'm setting it up. You'll need some way to connect your SD card to the computer. So this is just a small USB SD card, and you slide the SD card in the USB slot, and this goes right into your computer. It's pretty handy. There's a ton of different ways you can do this. Some computers or laptops may have it. If you have nothing else, there are ways to use your phone, and that may be handy. If you've got an SD card reader on your phone, you can put it in your phone, format it, and do it that way. Be careful with that, because sometimes your phone will automatically install stuff, just like Windows, like we'll see, and that could cause some issues getting it to boot properly. These use the micro HDMI, and you'll need one of those cables to take the HDMI from the Raspberry Pi to whatever source you're using if you're not using SSH. If you don't know what SSH is, get one of these cables. It'll help you set things up initially, and you'll have to at some point be able to access the Pi hole locally so that you can set up SSH. That's not something I cover in this video, but when we get to the monitor and we start looking up setting up the Pi hole, there's a spot in the configuration utility where you can set up SSH. Or once you get it on the network, there's a text file that you can put on your Raspberry Pi. There's guides that you can look up that will tell you how to do that. And then the power. So this one, and this is a Raspberry Pi 4, so it's powered via USB-C. In this particular one, we'll do 5 volts at about 3.5 amps. If you have something that is putting out less amperage than that, you may or may not get the full performance. Some Raspberry Pis can be powered off of just USB power, and they're made to be really low power devices that you can run all the time. If you have something that is a little bit more power like this, that you can plug in. That's just going to make sure you have a good stable connection, and when there's a heavy load, it doesn't drop down and turn itself off. It is pretty smart. It'll downscale some of its services kind of intelligently to manage power, but as a lot of times it won't work super well. So that's what you need to get this started. And next we'll move into actually looking at the computer, setting it up. We'll get the SD card ready first, get that installed in the Pi, launch Raspbian, and then set up Pi-hole. All right, so here we are in Windows, and just in case you're curious, this is on my workstation build that I have assembled right next to this monitor on the table. So you can see that it is the computer I was working on, the 7940X. So it is up and running. I'm currently still doing some testing on it, but since it's here, I'm going to use it to set up the Pi-hole. And I'm going to do that live on this video to show you step by step what you actually need to do to get it up and running. A lot of videos that I've seen, and when I first learned how to do this, I had to piece it together from various sources, and it wasn't very user-friendly because everybody seemed to leave out something for some reason. So if you do have a Raspberry Pi and you want to do a DNS ad blocker like Pi-hole on your server, I'll go through that on this one. Like I said, in this example, I'm using a Raspberry Pi 4, but it'll work, and you certainly don't need a Raspberry Pi 4 for this. I use a Raspberry Pi 3 on my home network, and once this is complete and installed, we'll switch over to that one to show you the interface. But the Raspberry Pi 4 has far more computing power than is required by a Pi-hole. So the very first thing to do is to get the SD card formatted and prepared, and I'll insert the SD card into the motherboard USB slot just so you can see kind of the whole thing happen step by step if you want to follow along. Okay, so it just popped up. It's asking me if I want to format it. I did have Octopi on here for my 3D printer, so I'm just going to go ahead and format the USB drive, and we'll start with a blank slate. This is just a normal 30 gigabyte drive. Use FAT32, and the allocation size is something that basically how big the chunks will be on the drive. If you want a little bit better performance, typically that will be associated with higher allocation sizes. But if you have a lot of small files, those will have to be divided if they're smaller than 64 kilobytes. Like a bunch of text files on a Raspberry Pi that has a whole lot of information, you probably want to go with smaller 16 kilobyte allocation, but with current generation technology, it's not going to matter too much. So we'll go ahead and just do a quick format, erase everything on there, and that's complete. So once that's complete, we have, and you can see it here, the USB drive, it's completely empty. And there's this other drive on here. That's a boot drive. So actually, because I had this partitioned differently, we're going to have to do an extra step. So if you do have an SD card, you want to look for this application disk management in Windows. And if you have an SD card that has multiple partitions on it, you can get rid of those here. So this is my 30 gigabyte SanDisk drive. This is my SSD that's in the computer, so I don't want to mess with those. And there's that extra partition. So what we'll actually do is delete both of these partitions, and we'll have this one big unallocated space, and then make a new volume with that space. We'll make it FAT32, and then we'll use Etcher to actually put the file onto it. See, this wants to use the whole drive. We'll assign it E, and this is just the standard process. The allocation size, we can again set this to 16K if we wanted, or we could just leave it to default and see what happens. What we're basically doing now is just making sure we have access to the whole drive. All right, so now that we've done that, I've already downloaded Etcher, and that's a piece of software here that you can use to etch OS images, so a bootable image, to a drive. It'll create all the partitions and stuff for you. But what we did just before was to make sure that we had access to the whole drive. Close a couple of these windows. So I've already downloaded Etcher, and it is right here. So this is the portable version of it. We'll go ahead and run that and use the image for Raspberry Pi that I downloaded. So I'll be using Raspbian. All right, so it has been about 10 minutes. This is recording in post, and we're going to go ahead and stop here and continue in the next one, starting with installing Raspbian and getting the Pi hole set up. See you in the next one.